The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. An Odyssey to Jerusalem. By Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Bryan Godwin. Part 6. On the Sea. The next morning, we were again taken by the German automobile of the responsible Ottoman authorities from the Palace Hotel to the port of Constantinople, which was located in the immediate vicinity in the historic district of Galata, which was characterized by the striking watchtower from late Byzantine and Genoese times. The port itself was in a state of change. Only last year, a French company had renewed the facilities. Now, they were to be expanded into a modern cargo port, which would be of considerable economic importance. We boarded a passenger ship, which after short stopovers in Izmir, Antalya, and Mersin, was to arrive in the Palestinian Jaffa after 5 days. Holmes and I had our luggage brought to our cabin. Then we set out on deck to watch the departure. It was a sight to behold. We looked back at the impressive city of Constantinople, and left the Strait of the Bosporus in the southerly direction, where we entered the Sea of Marmara. After that, the exciting passage of the Dardanelles would follow, and then the ship would reach the Aegean Sea. Our fellow travelers differed from the ones on the Orient Express. We noticed that there were primarily pilgrims on board who, like us, were on their way to Jerusalem. Most of them were Christian Europeans from all sorts of countries, ordinary people, as well as priests and monks, but also Eastern European Jews and Muslims from Albania and Bosnia. A colorful mixture that would undoubtedly fit Jerusalem and which, despite all the differences, was looking for only one thing: taking one step closer to God. All in all, I estimated the number of passengers, most of whom were content with the mass accommodation below deck at up to 100 people. Holmes and I, on the other hand, were privileged. We had our own cabin, which was also necessary for our mission, because it was time to discuss the situation that Said Halim had described to us during our conversation at the Yildiz Palace privately. "What do you think of the recent reports from Jerusalem?" I began as we sat below deck at a simple wooden table. "Certainly, there is a conflict," Holmes replied. "The official was right. But I don't see it escalating in a way which would harm people. This is probably due to the strategy and tactics of the perpetrators. They strive for sympathy among the population and seem to be successful. For the Ottoman authorities, however, this makes the situation even more difficult. A violent oppression seems to be no option." "Makes sense," I added. "Worst case scenario would be a civil war. This could have far-reaching consequences for the entire Ottoman Empire, because there are also influential groups within the political and military circles that are in opposition to the Sultan's government. In the end, Turkey could even become a republic, and the leading role among Muslims could be lost. And if there is a war, then the strengthened Greeks would certainly do everything in their power to reconquer Constantinople, and perhaps also the coasts of Asia Minor." Holmes poured himself a glass of water from the clay jug at the table. "We want to leave aside any implications of your military strategic expertise for the time being," he said. "I was giving some thought to the pamphlet that was distributed in Jerusalem. Although it calls for resistance, it does not call for a rebellion. The destruction of the arsenal of weapons, which could just as well have been seized, also speaks against this. There is a plan behind it that we need to fathom. There are obviously clever and possibly also experienced people at work, which is quite surprising. And apparently they also have access to explosives, the origin of which remains unclear." I looked at my friend's thoughtful face. "You suspect outside support?" I asked. "That's conceivable," Holmes confirmed, but provided no further explanations. So it was up to me to make assumptions in this regard. "Maybe," I began to explain, "a Christian group is trying to liberate the Holy Land from the rule of Islam? A crusade from within, so to speak?" Holmes gave me an amused smile. "And the mastermind in the background would be the Pope in Rome, right? No, it does not seem like a purely confessional conflict. This is also not the message written in the pamphlet." After a few minutes of consideration, I brought forth a new idea. You told me about this Zionist movement in Vienna. Their goal is the establishment of a Jewish state, preferably, of course, in Palestine, where the presumed graves of Kings David and Solomon lie. The first step in this direction would, of course, be the expulsion of the Ottomans from the area. And Mr. Herzl, Holmes replied skeptically, a harmless Austrian feuilleton organizing attacks in Jerusalem for this purpose? That seems far-fetched to me. In addition, the population structure would remain diverse, with many Arab Muslims and Christians. It would take millions of Jewish immigrants from Europe to gain control over Palestine. This movement lacks the support and the means for an enterprise like that. Many European Jews reject this plan. I was running out of ideas. Perhaps my ideas are a little stark, I admitted. Perhaps the nature of the attacks, which I automatically assumed, is just a pretext, a sort of distraction, and there is something completely different behind it. Anarchists, socialists, or simply a crime syndicate? Holmes denied. To my knowledge, neither Mr. Marx or Kropotkin have found any residence in the Middle East. There is no industrial proletariat there. However, on a very basic level, you have made a good point, Watson. We have to investigate all possible directions, and we have to stick to the facts. Your speculation won't get us far. They are assumptions, I disagreed, certain probabilities. Assumptions without any foundation, Holmes claimed, suitable for the adventurous script of a writer, not for the analysis of a detective. I was a little offended at my friend's rejections of my thoughts. On the other hand, though, he was kind of right. It was all just speculation. If any future evidence would support them, we would have to reconsider them anyway. All right, I said. Let's try to stick to the facts then. Someone is trying to undermine Ottoman control of Palestine, and possible escalation lies underneath. What do you suggest we do? Wait and drink tea? Holmes took a sip of his water and replied, You need to hold your horses, my dear Watson. This is a basic rule of investigative work. But not exactly a plan, I returned. I'm still working on that, Holmes said. I'll let you know when I'm ready. For now, I suggest that you simply enjoy the cruise through the eastern Mediterranean Sea. We will soon pass Lesbos and Smyrna. Then sail past Ephesus, Halicarnassus, and Rhodes, Myra, and Seleucia. From the railing, you will surely catch a glimpse of a few Greek, Hellenistic, and Roman ruins. Unfortunately, you have already missed Troy, but there is not much to see there, despite all the efforts of Mr. Schliemann. I followed my friend's advice and tried to calm down. There were truly more unpleasant things on a boat trip along the coast of Asia Minor, so I went and spent a lot of time on deck and kept my eyes on the sights of the mainland close in view, looking at the emerging islands and getting my mind in tune with the gentle swaying of the sea. In this manner, the days passed surprisingly quickly, and the one or other random conversation with the other passengers proved to be revealing. Especially from the Catholics, I got the impression that their trip to Jerusalem was understood primarily as a sacred fulfillment of duty and submission, while the Protestants, not least the Germans, viewed the matter more from a practical point of view. They seemed to be more interested in the pre-Christian history of Judea, Galilee, and Samaria, which they in turn shared with their fellow Jewish travelers. In the light of Martin Luther's sometimes rather hostile opinion about Jews, them mingling like that was not, at least theologically, explainable to me. Admittedly, though, the Catholics certainly had a centuries-old advantage in the discrimination and persecution of Jews in their countries. I couldn't really get into contact with the Muslim fellows on board, though. They were exceptionally friendly and courteous at all times, but there was always a certain mistrust of Christians lingering, and thus of me. I guess they could not be completely blamed for this. It was already the fourth day of the crossing, when I stood at the railing with a young man from Holland who, as he assured me, wanted to renew his faith in Jerusalem. However, our conversation was abruptly interrupted when we witnessed an argument a few meters away. Two men were heavily discussing something in what seemed like an outlandish version of the German language, and became more and more heated. Eventually, they even started beating each other, and I decided to intervene before anyone else would be injured. Even though that was not the case, I was too late after all. Suddenly, one grabbed the other with both hands, pushed him into the railing, and threw him overboard. and the next moment, the sound of the unfortunate man involuntarily immersing into the sea was heard, and the water splashing back to the deck. I immediately bent over the low-set railing. The man emerging from the water made quick and helpless movements with his arms. Obviously, he could not swim and was about to drown. I hesitated for a moment, then I shouted, "Man overboard!" But the bystanders, including the attackers, seemed rigid with fright. I looked around, spotted a safety buoy, grabbed it, and hurried back to the railing. The man in the water submerged again and again. Not much time was left for him to survive. In the spur of the moment, I jumped into the sea myself, the life buoy in my hand. The water was colder than expected, and swimming with all my clothes on proved to be more difficult than I wanted. But after a few seconds, I reached the drowning man. He swung his arms around wildly when I offered him the safety buoy, and finally clung to me instead of the swimming aid. Of course, he put both of us in mortal danger, because he was much too heavy for me to be able to keep our common weight afloat, especially since he did not stop waving his arms. "Calm down, I will save you," I assured out loud, but that didn't help. The man was in a full state of panic, and was no longer able to follow any of my instructions. I struggled hard, trying not to be dragged down by him, and ended up swallowing more salt water than I would have liked. I had to make a decision. If I would get rid of him, I would at least save my own life, but the man would inevitably be lost and drown helplessly. In this respect, I had only one choice. With 2 powerful punches to the head, I managed to render him harmless. I had knocked him out like a reeling opponent in a boxing match. Now that he was unconscious, he was no longer able to resist his rescue, but his weight still dragged us down. Fortunately, I found my grip on the floating life buoy again, and with its help, I was able to keep both of us afloat. In the meantime, the ship had stopped at a distance and launched a small dinghy. 2 men rowed in our direction and reached us just in time before my own strength was about to abandon me. The man who fell into the sea was first pulled into the boat. Then a helping hand was extended to me. To my surprise, it was that of Holmes. "For heaven's sakes, Watson," he said in a reproachful tone, which, of course, was only played. "Do you really think this is the right time to take a dip in the sea?" We were completely soaked and slightly hypothermic, but finally brought back on board unharmed, where the unconscious man also had gathered himself. He should not suffer any permanent damage. Later, Holmes and I found out what had led to the altercation in which he had been pushed into the sea. He was a Catholic from Bavaria, who had a quarrel with a fellow believer from neighboring Tyrol. There was apparently a considerable disagreement about the decisions of the Vatican Council, whereby the man from the Austrian Alps had questioned in particular the dogma about the infallibility of the Pope, which in turn his Bavarian colleague did not want to hear. His pig-headedness was the reason he was then unceremoniously thrown into the water. A priest from Munich tried to mediate the following day, which at least settled their conflict, so that there were no more violent incidents of that sort for the rest of the trip. However, I had gained 2 insights. On the one hand, I learned that disagreements on religious issues were not only widespread between Protestants and Catholics, between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, but that there were conflicts even among the followers of the supposedly uniform Catholic faith, which made peaceful coexistence even more difficult. My other experience concerned climatic conditions in the narrower sense. The open Mediterranean Sea could reach quite low temperatures in December, and was not necessarily suitable for an untarnished bathing pleasure at this time of year, even for Canal and North Sea tested Britons.